Hello, this is Phil Candreva again with the Naval Postgraduate School. This is part two of the Fiscal Reality series looking at the federal and defense budget, current figures, and trends over time. Here in part two, we're going to look specifically at the defense budget. Part one covered the overall federal budget. And we're going to look at this in two parts. Part one will look at, again, these trends in the defense and the Navy budgets. And then the second part will explore some budget issues that are currently on the minds of Navy and defense leaders here in the spring of 2020. This first slide shows national defense outlays by three different measures. The first measure, this green line, is in billions of FY 2020 dollars. So it's adjusted for inflation. And we can see that the budget is currently at about $720 billion. It peaked in 2011 for nearly $800 billion. And we see that it's cyclical in nature, with peaks corresponding to the Korean conflict, Vietnam, the Reagan buildup, the war on terrorism. The next measure is defense as the percent of federal spending, and the percentages are on the right axis. And we see that as a percent of the federal budget, the military has gone from nearly 2/3 of the budget down to about 15–18%. The third measure is defense as a percent of gross domestic product, or what portion of the economy do we devote to defense? And back here during the Korean conflict, it was about 15% of the economy. Now we're down to about 3%. So you might think of the blue line as sort of like an insurance policy. How much of your annual income should you pay to protect that income? The red line is if government is what government spends, government is more and more something other than defense. And if you saw part one of this, you see that that has been largely replaced with income security programs and health programs. The 2011 peak was the highest defense spending was since World War II, measured in dollars. Alternative facts: defense as a percent of the federal budget is near an all-time low. So if you want to argue that defense spending is too high and you think it should come down, you talk about defense in dollars. If you think the defense budget is too small and ought to go up, you might want to use a relative measure. Defense as a percent of federal spending, or defense as a percent of the economy. We're going to stick with this green line for a little bit. Notice that the peaks in Korea, Vietnam, and the Reagan buildup were all a little over $600 billion in today's terms. Each of the last 15 years, defense budgets have been above those historic peaks. So even in the time of sequestration and the Budget Control Act, we never got below the peak of the Reagan buildup or the peak of the Vietnam War or the peak of the Korean War. So by historical standards, the amount of money in the Department of Defense today is unusually high. At the peak of the Reagan buildup, the Department of Defense in 1 year bought 338 fighter aircraft and 23 ships. At the recent peak, we bought 56 fighter aircraft and only 7 ships. Lots of reasons for this. The aircraft and the ships are significantly more complex, and the military is not just hardware anymore, it's hardware networked with other things. So the capability of those 56 fighters and 7 ships may have been greater than in the past. But we are a military that does count things, right? And we have goals for a size of a Navy. And we have been buying a lot less in terms of absolute numbers recently than we have in the past. Now let's look at the defense budget broken out by military service. Is it really true that each service gets 1/3 of the budget? Well, here's the Army. Notice that the Army's budget, and this is in inflation adjusted dollars, is cyclical just like the top line of the budget, only it's a little bit more extreme. Notice the significant increase from the late 90s to the peak of the War on Terror. The Army budget tripled. It has since been cut in half. So we see that the Army budget is rather volatile, particularly during periods of hostilities. An Army in garrison is relatively inexpensive. An Army on the move is quite costly. In comparison, here's the Navy top line. Notice that the Navy, during periods of relative peace, has a larger budget than the Army, mainly because the Navy is capital intensive and the Army is more human intensive. But during periods of conflict, here, here, and here, the Army got more money than the Navy. The Air Force line, because the Air Force is also capital intensive, tends to follow the Navy line, with one major exception, which was back here in the 50s and early 60s when the Air Force had the primary lead in developing the nation's nuclear arsenal. But this isn't all of the spending. There's the fourth estate, those defense-wide activities. Think of the Office of the Secretary of Defense, DFAS, DLA, those kinds of agencies. That portion of the Department of Defense has been taking a larger and larger share. It's not a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split. In fact, we're rapidly approaching 25% each, including the defense-wide or fourth estate. I think the only time it was really close to a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split was way back here around 1950. Otherwise, that myth just isn't true. Now let's look at the defense budget by appropriation title. So there's DoD mil-PERS spending, and again the axis is inflation adjusted dollars. Then we see little bumps around Korea and Vietnam where we brought in more people. And then it went relatively flat. We had our peace dividend after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early to late 90s. And then we increased a little bit again for the War on Terror. But this is in dollars, not in people, which is important to note. There are about 1.5 million people on active duty today. Back here, there were about 3 million people on active duty. So the cost per person has gone up, in large part due to grade creep. The average rank in the military today is higher than it was back here. Back here, it was common to see enlisted personnel cooking in galleys on bases, cutting the grass, doing a lot of administrative type functions, most of which have been outsourced and contracted out. And so we have O3s and O4s managing contracts rather than large numbers of junior enlisted doing this work. And so the average grade has increased. Here's O&M. Now notice that from the end of World War II until the peak of the Reagan buildup, mil-PERS was the largest account, in part due to that outsourcing and in part due to the cost of maintaining more and more expensive equipment. Since the late 80s, O&M has been the largest account, and notice the general trend is upward. O&M spending, if you exclude the peaks due to warfare, is rising about 3% above inflation and taking an ever-increasing piece of the defense budget pie. Procurement is the green line. Notice it's much more jagged than the blue or the red lines. You know, if we have a force, we need to maintain it. If we have people, we can't add and subtract people very quickly. So those lines tend to be smooth. We can add and subtract quantities of items we're buying fairly quickly. We could decide to award that contract and buy 100 cruise missiles, or we could buy 75 cruise missiles, and we can turn those switches on and off more easily. And so we see procurement tends to be more of a jagged line and more responsive to movement and the total amount of money available. Maybe it takes a disproportionate share when budgets come down, but it gets a disproportionate gain when budgets go up. R&D, steadily rising, similar to O&M, growing steadily over time, again, as our equipment is more and more sophisticated and more difficult to design, and taking advantage of things like information technology. Military construction and family housing, and the last line was everything else. Now let's look specifically at the Department of the Navy, because this is the Naval Postgraduate School. This blue field is the total amount the Navy received in inflation-adjusted dollars on the right-hand vertical axis, currently at about $200 billion. And a little less than where the Navy was back here in the late 90s, early 2000s. This is mil-pers, Navy, steadily declining, but with its peace dividend here and an increase for the war on terrorism, and then coming back down to the basic trend line. O&M, similar to DoD as a whole, basic upward climb. Procurement, fairly jagged, but on a net downward decline over the last 60 years or so. There's R&D, and that's everything else. So mil-pers tends to be counter-cyclical to the top line. Like I said, we can't add or subtract people very quickly. So when the budget comes down, if we're spending the same amount of money on people as a percentage, then that number would go up. Procurement is cyclical with the top line. When the budget goes up, procurement goes up. When the budget goes down, procurement goes down. How well has the Navy done in predicting its budgets? So each year when the budget comes out, there is a handbook that the Navy prints that includes a projection of future year budgets. And so I went all the way back to 2001 and plotted out what were those projections each budget cycle. And here are the lines. Pretty steady growth until the Budget Control Act was passed in the year 2011, which impacted budgets from the years 2013 and out. And what was happening during this period of time, if you were to put this in human terms, let's say you were here earning about $100,000 a year, and your boss says to you, I'm going to give you a 5% pay raise every year. And you think about that and you do the math and you go, in 6 years, I'm going to be making $134,000 a year. And over those 6 years, I would not have made $600,000, which you would have earned if it was flat. You will have earned $700,000 in total. And so you think, what am I going to do with that extra $100,000? And you may go out and you may buy a new car or put it in a child's college fund or something like that. So from 2002 to 2011, base budgets were slightly larger than anticipated, and OCO, the Overseas Contingency Operations, the wartime money, was added on top. It's not included in here. Then Congress passed the Budget Control Act, and they basically said, hey, those 5% per year increases, that's going to stop. And here's what future budgets look like. They basically went flat. From 2011 to 2018, these expectations of continued growth were not realized, and requests for increased out-year budgets were not funded. The heavy black line is actuals, except where it's dotted. So this space here, where we were hoping for those continued gains, did not happen. We in fact fell a little bit and then recovered. If we had continued on that trajectory, in this space would have been about $1 trillion additional dollars for the Navy that we never got, but we had plans for. So when the budget was flat like this and we had plans to do this, all of the things we wanted to buy with all of this money, we couldn't, and those plans were deferred. Now we're back to climbing budgets again. And the question is, will they continue to grow? And it's important to remember that budgets are requests, not forecasts. Back here, after the Budget Control Act was enacted, we may have forecasted low budgets, but we requested bigger budgets. Why? Because we wanted bigger budgets. Over much of the last 25 years, the size of the Navy has fallen. That's the gray field. Yet the number of ships deployed has remained pretty level. About 100 ships at any given time are off on deployment. So if you have a Navy of 454 ships and you deploy 110 of them, that's about a quarter of the force. But if you're down to 276 ships and you're deploying nearly 100 of them, now a third of the force is on deployment. And the only way that's going to work is if you stretch out the length of deployments. And we went from about 180 days or so, roughly 6-month deployments, up to deployments lasting 220, 230 days and more. And this is on average, which means half of the ships or so deployed even longer than that. So questions to think about, or that we could discuss in class. What are the key trends in the DoD and Navy top line, allocations by department and allocations by appropriation, and what, if anything, concerns you? So now let's look at the second part of this. What are some of the current issues in the Navy and defense budgets? The big one is this quest to get to a 355 ship Navy. So how have we done with respect to shipbuilding? Well, every year when we put the budget together, we display a chart, the shipbuilding that we would like to do going forward, the plan for shipbuilding. And this was the plan in our FY20 budget, going across the years. Here was the plan in the FY21 budget, says that we plan to build 44 ships. If we go back in time and look at those annual budget books, this is what we said we were planning to build for the next 5 years. 2002, 2010 only provided 1 year of estimates. All the others provided a 5-year plan, ranging from about mid-30s, 35 to 55 ships over that 5-year period, or anywhere from 7 to 11 ships per year on average. So how many did we actually build? The red lines. And there's something curious about this chart. If you think back to the one where I showed the out-year budget requests, during that period of time from 2001 to 2011, 2012 or so, where we got all the money we asked for, we overestimated in every budget. We did not build in any of those years as many ships as we claimed we wanted, as many as we planned to build. Yet after the Budget Control Act was passed, and the sequestration years, 2013 and on, each of those budgets curiously underestimated the number of ships that would end up being built. I don't have a good explanation for this, but when budgets were growing, we overestimated. When budgets were uncertain, we underestimated. Another concern, continuing resolutions. What this chart is plotting are the number and duration of continuing resolutions for each fiscal year going back to fiscal year 2003. Because it's not only the length of continuing resolutions that are disruptive, it's how many that we're dealing with that's a problem. So if you take a year like 2013, we had a shutdown for a little while, but we ended up with one long continuing resolution that went 176 days. Basically, the fiscal year was cut in half. But we can at least write a 6-month long contract with 176 days of funding and then update it when we got the rest of the budget. You take another year like 2011, and in 2011 there were 7 continuing resolutions lasting anywhere from 2 months to a couple of days. And that gets very disruptive because we don't know how long the next tranche of money will be, nor do we know what our final authorities are going to be. Notice that in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of those years, we got our appropriation on time. There was no need for a continuing resolution. And in fact, in 2019, we got both the authorization and the appropriation on time, which was a good year. So you may look at this and say, well, that's not a very good track record for Congress. They're late most of the time, 72% of the time in this 18-year span. I wonder if that's a result of the extreme partisanship we see in Washington. So I went back 50 years, looked at authorization bills and appropriation bills to see how often are they late. Authorization bills are in blue, appropriation acts are in red. If the line extends to the left, it was passed early. If it extends to the right, it was passed late. So, authorization bills. Most of them are late. Appropriation bills. Most of them are late. In fact, authorizations are late 82% of the time, and on average, when they're late, we don't see the authorization until around Thanksgiving. Appropriations are late 80% of the time in the last 50 years. And when late, we usually don't see the appropriation until mid-December. And 60% of the time, the authorization comes after the appropriation, when ideally it should be the other way around. And only 4 times in those 50 years were both on time. So it's not a current phenomenon. It is a structural problem in our federal budget process. Another thing we're concerned about is execution in general. Are we executing all of the funding? And you may be familiar with the phrase use or lose. So is there any evidence of a use or lose phenomenon? Well, if we look at the 2019 Defense Appropriation Act, we can find such evidence. Congress reduced the MILPERS appropriation by over $300 million for historical under-execution. We didn't spend all the money. And another $2.5 million because they thought we would continue to under-execute. And in O&M, it was 3 times worse. $1.1 billion was cut from the O&M budget across the DoD for historical under-execution, and another $263 million was reduced for projected under-execution. This is a lot of money, right? That $1 billion is approximately equal to the amount that the Navy spends on aviation depot maintenance every year. It's a concern for defense leadership that we do spend the money fully in order not to see future budgets reduced. So what are some of the other concerns we have right now in defense budgeting? One is this overall federal budgeting context. The Budget Control Act and the caps on discretionary spending limit our ability to grow the defense budget. These persistent continuing resolutions. There's been continued misuse of OCO money, the war money, because that's not subject to the budget caps. And so both the executive branch and the Congress have played games with that and given us base requirements funded in wartime money to avoid the caps, which is just not good, transparent, proper budgeting. There's concern about the FY20 presidential election and what changes the next administration may bring. And as I record this video, I am homebound as we deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, and Congress has passed a $2 trillion stimulus bill, which may impact the federal government's ability to fund other things. Secondly, we've got this long-standing concern about executing effectively. And is that problem one of estimating the requirements accurately? Is it one about costing those requirements accurately? Is it managing the money? Is it the priority shift over time? Some combination or something else? And there's a lot of efforts going on to try and get our budgets more accurate. And lastly is the question of audit. We got off to a rocky start. The requirement has been out there since 1990. It was not well understood. There were some misplaced expectations about what audit was and what it would do for us. The status today, a lot of good long-term planning that's marred from time to time with some short-sighted actions. There'll be a separate video on audit. I invite you to watch that when it's up. So, fiscal reality. What's going on in the defense budget over time? What are some of the current issues? Appreciate your time and attention. If you haven't already watched it, please watch part 1 of this that looks at the overall federal budget and the state of funding and debt in society today.